environment there. Please welcome Mary Kissel.
Thanks, everybody, for such a warm welcome. I am truly honored to be addressing the National Press Club today, especially in Canberra's centennial year. I'd like to talk today about the ruptures that have been going on in American politics, which have been very dramatic over the last couple of years, and I think very largely misunderstood abroad. The kind of crude storyline is that President Obama is a transformative figure who's reversed the Reagan Revolution, perhaps permanently. And Republicans, for their part, have been pulled to the right, the extreme right, by this thing called the Tea Party, and they're struggling to communicate a unified message, squabbling amongst themselves. In other words, it's kind of a grim season for conservatives in the United States and mourning again for the Democrats. I disagree, and that's what I'll argue to you today, although I will acknowledge that the Republicans do have their work cut out for them. It's important to understand that, like this country, American politics are very cyclical affairs, especially after profound national shocks. The country turned to statism after the Great Depression, and I think that Barack Obama sensed that after the financial crisis of 2008, there was an opportunity to turn there again. But he had a problem. The 2008 crisis decimated our middle class. It decimated our seniors, the baby boomers, the savers. But no one really believed in statism anymore in America. They had looked to Latin America and the democracies there. They had seen the collapse of these social democracies in Europe. We all know what happened to the Soviet Union. So then Senator Obama couldn't really sell that message in the language in which he had become accustomed through academia, through his community work. He's really a student of the left. So he did something very clever. He cloaked these very far left statist instincts in the language of conservatism, in very powerful language, human language, language of equity and fairness and opportunity, the Yes We Can slogan, or Si Se Puede for our Hispanic population, which is increasingly important. He said, "We remain more than a collection of red states and blue states. We are forever the United States of America." That's what he told people at his victory speech. Who can disagree with that? He was also the quintessential anti-George W. Bush. Here was a guy who was cool, collected, inclusive, who could rise above these turbulent times and this crisis that we were all going through. He would listen to his rivals. He would temper the Bush policies, but not too much. He would just pull us a little bit back towards the middle, not reverse them. That's what he promised. And his campaign team, it was run by the Chicagoans, David Axelrod and Jim Messina, sold this message, but they also did something very important. They expanded the Democratic base by harnessing the power of social media, in effect instituting a permanent campaign. This is something that we've never seen before in America. They had people in key swing states all across the country, not just during the campaign, but through the whole first 4 years of their presidency. And that's now been turned into a nonprofit. It went from Obama for America to Organizing for America, and now it has some other name, which is still OFA of some sort. But this coalition is very important, and it's one of the arguments that what he's doing is really transformational. It includes blacks, Hispanics, single women, college students, blue-collar union workers, the poor, the wealthy urban elites. But the Obama majority, and this wasn't really covered so much abroad, the Obama majority was ushered into power in large part because Republicans stayed home and sat on their hands in 2008. And they did it again last year. Now, there are many explanations for why this happened. It's kind of like the later John Howard years here. I think a lot of Republicans were just sick of conservative rule. They were sick of Bush. They were sick of the big spending Congress, and they wanted a change. Perhaps they wanted to support the country's first black president, which was really a historic achievement for us, and one in which I think many Americans on both sides of the aisle wanted to participate in, regardless of their politics or their ethnic or racial backgrounds. And they also weren't perhaps convinced by the Republicans' message in '08, or even last year. You had a lot of warring factions. Perhaps it was all three. But the Obama agenda of the first term, this kind of transformative first term, so-called, wasn't the centrist cooperative vision that he sold to the American people. In the first 2 years of office, with the help of this congressional majority led by Speaker Nancy Pelosi, he rammed through Congress, really with no Republican votes to support him, hundreds of millions of dollars in stimulus spending, nationalized health care. He expanded our regulatory state. He formed new bureaucracies like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He raised taxes. He raised government spending to 24% of GDP, which is, by the way, European levels, which is up from a historic average of just a little under 20%. Our largest insurer, our biggest car companies, our largest banks, practically the entire housing industry was nationalized. The president himself also emerged as an unusually kind of cold-blooded, solitary figure, a man who wrote 2 biographies of himself before the age of 40, and has cultivated really no close friends on either side of politics. This is a big change from Democrats like, say, Bill Clinton, who was kind of alternatively loved and hated by both Republicans and Democrats throughout his career. He did some extraordinary things. He berated a Supreme Court justice in the State of the Union address. He berated Paul Ryan, who was the Republican head of the budget process, trying to come up with a way to compromise on entitlement reform. He's lamented that he's not an emperor. He rarely speaks to Congress. Instead, he'll say, "I'm ready to pass bills, guys," as he sits there and waits for the bills to come to him. And he demonizes the opposition, as this latest sequester fight shows. But I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. I think that his administration resembles something like a Latin American elected demagogue, more than this kind of moderate Clintonian model that many moderate Democrats in America and many Republicans got comfortable with and were used to. It's really quite a shift. So what was this transformation? What did it produce? It produced the weakest economic recovery since the Great Depression. It has been absolutely devastating for blacks in America. This is probably the most damaging presidency for the black population in our modern history. You have unemployment rates for blacks well into double digits, reaching even into the 30% range in some of our urban centers. Median income adjusted for inflation has fallen every single year since the president took office. So even though we have this economic recovery, nobody feels the economic recovery because our incomes aren't rising. 1 in 7 Americans is now dependent on food stamps, the highest level in our history. Welfare rolls are exploding. Healthcare costs are up. No American president in our modern history has ever been reelected with more than 7% unemployment and declining jobless rates. Yet he won. So you might ask, does that mean that Americans have endorsed this agenda, that they like these outcomes? I'm going to argue that they actually don't. I think that the re-election victory last year was due more to Republican weakness in disarray than a resounding mandate for the Obama platform. I mean, Republicans, after all, nominated the only man who could lose that election, an aristocratic plutocrat. This is a guy who goes to Daytona Beach, Florida, home of NASCAR, and says, I quote, "I've got friends who are NASCAR team owners." And then he points to the guy who's wearing a poncho and he says, "Gee, buddy, you couldn't afford to buy an umbrella?" This is not the common touch. This is not the way Republicans are going to win back the White House. But more seriously, he really couldn't marshal an argument against Obamacare, which was the biggest card that Republicans really had. It was the Democrats' signature achievement. It's what the president really staked all his political capital on in his first term. Americans hate this. In fact, it's hugely unpopular. It's never had a majority of support, and it's getting more unpopular the longer we have it in law and the more we learn about it. Well, Mitt couldn't argue against it because Mitt created the prototype for it in Massachusetts. And he really couldn't connect conservative economics to outcomes. He couldn't explain why a smaller government agenda or lower taxes really is good for the poor. He couldn't explain or respond to these charges of trickle-down economics that you're so used to hearing. He did it in the first debate, but he never did it again, and that's not enough. So as a result, for the first time ever, we had a president who was reelected with a smaller share of the popular vote than he got the first time around, even though the Electoral College vote wasn't close at all. It was a blowout on the Electoral College side. So how did he do this? Well, first, the Republican disarray, but he also targeted key swing states, and he promised a lot of people a lot of goodies. Free college for college kids, free pre-K education for younger kids, free medical care for everybody. He didn't defend his economic record. In fact, he didn't focus on it or speak of it ever. And he also didn't talk about what he wanted to do in the future. He talked in very gauzy, vague language. He really hammered home empathetic themes. So he talked about equal pay for women, marriage for gays. And he also stoked racial tensions pretty significantly in America because he started talking about the return to Jim Crow era voting laws. This was an era where blacks were restricted from voting. And then this political machine that I talked about earlier got Americans out to the polls. So it was a very, very nasty campaign to behold, but it worked. The problem is that to truly be a transformative president, to have the kind of legacy that other great Democratic presidents have had, FDR, LBJ, these are the people that the President Obama identifies with and strives to be like. He's going to have to figure out a way to pay for this grand vision and all of these entitlements that he has instituted. And the American public, I think, innately understands this, particularly in the middle of the country, kind of like the Howard Battlers of my nation. That was the genesis of the Tea Party movement. The Tea Party movement wasn't an extremist, racist movement. It was actually a widespread grassroots movement that united housewives, small business people, independents, some of the same people who sat on their hands in the 2008 election came back to the polls in 2010. That's why the Republicans gave a huge majority to the GOP in the House in 2010. That's why Republicans control 30 out of 50 governorships. Very important. And that's why Republicans, even to this day, still retain large majorities in many of the state legislatures. It's why Obamacare is so deeply unpopular. If Americans really strongly believed in the Obama vision of the Democratic agenda, which, again, I think is distinct from the Clintonian version of it, then I think we'd still have Speaker Pelosi. The interesting thing to me is that the president doesn't seem to understand this political message, that there's discontent. He either doesn't perceive it or I don't think he really cares. I think his policy world uniquely revolves around government. To a degree that we have not seen in our modern history since the 1930s. It's kind of we the government, not we the people. And it's also largely based on his own personal ambition. You don't see him reaching out to other people in Congress, Democrat or Republican, because it has to be about him. It's not about him behind the scenes as a conciliator or a compromiser. It's really about him. Our editorial pages editorialized about these instincts throughout this period, and I think it was always there, but the American public just didn't see it. But when you think about, say, the 2008 inauguration, he said, the question today isn't whether government is too big or small, but whether it works, whether it helps families find decent jobs, care they can afford. He said, this is not the time for small plans. He was standing up in front of Greek columns. Americans just aren't used to this. This is not really our style of presidency. We're not used to an imperial presidency, which is, at least in terms of the aesthetics, kind of what it's beginning to sound like and what it's beginning to look like. That vision of government and government's role, I think, explains why he reacted in the way that he did to this recent sequester debate in Washington. He assumed that Republicans would never allow across-the-board budget cuts, particularly to defense. Republicans, strangely today, are the party of defense, whereas Democrats used to be the party of defense in the Kennedy era. But when it became clear that they might actually let this thing go through, he trotted out a parade of horribles across the country. He didn't go to Congress and try to negotiate. He went and he gave speeches straight to the American public. He said air traffic controllers aren't going to get paid. You're going to have long lines at the airports. Troops aren't going to get paid. Seniors aren't going to get their welfare benefits. As he said, and I quote, do I close funding for the disabled kid or the poor kid? End quote. I think this was a really big miscalculation. And I think it's the beginning of the cracks in this so-called transformative presidency, in this new Democratic coalition. The Republicans offered to give this president flexibility on where to cut, and at the end of the day, it's $44 billion in a $4 trillion, gosh, these numbers are big, annual budget. It doesn't make any difference whatsoever. It's completely a rounding error. Even the Washington Press Corps, which has historically treated presidents, particularly Democrats, with kid gloves, started to wonder what the fuss was all about. Why was this Armageddon coming? Where was it going to come from? And you know what? When you're a Democrat and you've lost Bob Woodward, I mean, you've really lost the argument. So the challenge for Republicans is, how are they going to build on this? Can they build on this? I think the first thing they have to realize is that all national coalitions in American politics are inherently brittle coalitions. Remember back in 2004, Karl Rove stitched together what many Democrats thought was a completely unstoppable Republican majority that was Southern evangelicals paired with libertarians, to some degree Hispanics, though not as much as during the Reagan years. And everybody thought that this would last forever. The party was for the Democrats. It didn't last because those groups had very different goals. The faith-based groups wanted faith-based big government spending. The libertarians wanted spending reined in. And eventually that coalition imploded and you got the Obama-Pelosi era. The Obama coalition has similar problems. Take our Keystone Pipeline debate. This is the big pipeline that's going to run from Canada down to the Gulf Coast. Environmentalists in the far left of the Democratic Party want to block that pipeline. But on the other side, you have blue-collar labor unions who want it built because, frankly speaking, in this lousy economy, they need the jobs. Or consider Obamacare's mandate that every employer provide abortion pills and contraceptives to women. Well, there's also a large portion of the Democratic Party that are Catholics. They're socially liberal Catholics, but they're still Catholics, and they don't like an unconstitutional curb on religious freedom. Or take immigration reform. Hispanics want it. Hispanics are a bulwark of the Democratic Party today, but labor unions are opposed to it because they don't want workers coming in and undercutting those labor salaries. So Republicans have their work cut out for them still, though, because of the messaging. They have to win this Hispanic coalition back. They don't have to play interest group politics and do what the president did, where he offered goodies to all the various interest groups, to women, to blacks, to Latinos. But they have to be able to talk to Hispanics. And they have to realize that these are natural Republicans. These are religious people. They are entrepreneurs. They are family-oriented. They're coming to America to make it. Former President Reagan was very popular with Hispanics, and so was former Florida Governor Jeb Bush. I don't know if I can mention the Bush name here, but he actually was a terrific governor of Florida. But they were both really charismatic guys, strong proponents of immigration reform. And I think if the party is going to win Hispanics, they're going to have to cultivate that message. I think Mitt Romney's dismal showing with Hispanics was because the guy basically said, can you please self-deport and we might build a fence. Really not a way to win. So I think that there are signs that Republicans have understood this message. The party is re-examining the immigration stance. We have Florida Senator Marco Rubio who's really driving that. They've got a raft of young, very accomplished Hispanic leaders who are not associated with the big spending, crony capitalism, corruption of the Bush years. That would include Senator Rubio, who's been mooted as a presidential candidate, although it's early, and New Mexico Governor Susana Martinez. And at the state level, you wouldn't think it. It gets no press coverage outside of the United States. In fact, it barely gets press coverage within the United States. But Republicans at the state level are just as diverse as Democrats are. You think of somebody like Nikki Haley of Indian descent, who's the governor of South Carolina, or Bobby Jindal, who's the governor of Louisiana, doing some very important reforms. These people could be leaders in the Republican Party to come. But the big question right now is, when are these bills going to come due that President Obama is racking up? And is that going to happen before the next election? The president has something of a reprieve because he just put a big tax increase into place, roughly $160 billion. But the House Republican majority is going to block any future tax increases, at least for the next 2 years. And the president's policies are not producing economic growth that are going to pay for everything that he wants to do. Eventually, he's going to try to tax the middle class to pay for his big government. And when those bills come due, that is the time when we're going to find out if President Obama is truly the transformational president that many Democrats and the commentariat, particularly abroad, think that he is. Will these interest groups become so reliant on government and government support that they continue to vote for Uncle Sugar? Or will America devolve into a populist democracy run by cronies on behalf of cronies? Will we see these revolving doors between New York and Washington, and can we never kick these people out? Or will the middle class, and that includes moderate Democrats and independents, finally get so fed up with higher taxes, crippling regulations, and this stagnant economy, and actually pull the lever for Republicans? I don't know the answer. I think a lot of that is up to Republicans. I think a good rule of thumb is don't nominate somebody named Mitt. But I do know one thing, that the permanence of this Obama era is far from assured. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Kissel. Let me ask you the first question.